Carl Jung, the brilliant and often controversial pioneer of analytical psychology, made many discoveries that reshaped our understanding of the human mind. He gave us concepts like the collective unconscious, archetypes, and the shadow point one, but his single most dangerous discovery had nothing to do with mental illness in the way we typically understand it. It was about a rare group of people who are fundamentally different, people who see everything that others miss, and why this extraordinary ability, this superpower of perception, so often destroys them. In his decades of clinical practice, Jung documented patients who possessed what he termed differentiated perception. These were not merely intuitive or empathetic individuals. They were something more. They could read the subtle, fleeting language of microexpressions. They could walk into a room and feel the hidden emotional currents, the unspoken resentments, the secret sorrows, the fragile alliances. They perceived the deep psychological patterns in families and organizations that escaped everyone else. They saw through the carefully constructed social masks we all wear. They detected deception not as a guess, but as a certainty, feeling the discordance in their own bodies. They felt the unconscious tensions in every room, the collective agreements to ignore uncomfortable truths. And Jung called this discovery dangerous, not because these people were unstable, but because this clarity of sight came with a devastating psychological cost that almost no one, not even the perceptive individuals themselves, could understand. Today, we will delve into the depths of Jung's most perilous discovery. We will explore the case that started it all, the different types of this perception, the profound dangers it entails, and finally, Jung's roadmap for transforming this potential curse into the very thing that can make a person extraordinary. This is the story of people who see everything, and why Jung believed this rare ability either destroys you or forces you to evolve into something more. The journey into this dangerous territory began with a single patient, a woman Jung described in his private notes, whom we shall call Helena. She came to him in 1913, a pivotal and tumultuous year for Jung. He was in the midst of his own profound psychological crisis following his painful and public break with his mentor, Sigmund Freud. It was a period where Jung himself was forced to confront the overwhelming power of the unconscious, a journey he would later document in his famous Red Book. Helena was the perfect mirror for Jung's own struggles. He described her as a highly introverted, deeply intuitive type. She didn't come to him with a simple neurosis. Her suffering was more existential. She felt fundamentally alien, as if she were a visitor from another world, trying and failing to understand the customs of this one. She possessed what Jung first termed undifferentiated intuitive perception. He wrote, "She could walk into any room, a dinner party, a family gathering, and immediately sense the entire psychological atmosphere. It was not a thought process. It was an instantaneous download of information. She knew who was lying to their spouse. She felt the gnawing anxiety of the man pretending to be confident. She perceived the deep, unspoken grief of a woman forcing a smile, who harbored secret resentments, who was on the verge of a breakdown. To Helena, it was as plain as the clothes they were wearing. Small talk was an unbearable form of torture for her, because she saw the immense chasm between the trivial words being spoken and the turbulent reality of the inner worlds behind them. She couldn't maintain friendships because people, sensing her clarity, felt exposed and deeply uncomfortable around her, as if their very souls were being X-rayed. She couldn't hold a job because her mere presence disrupted the delicate web of unspoken rules and collective illusions that allow groups to function. She would, for instance, sense that a popular project was destined to fail because the team leader was driven by unconscious narcissism, not by the company's best interests. When she would gently voice a practical concern, she wasn't heard as a helpful colleague, but as a disruptive heretic. Jung quickly realized he wasn't treating a conventional pathology. He was observing a rare state of being. He was witnessing what happens when the veil between the conscious and unconscious mind becomes too thin, when perception becomes too differentiated for social survival. He documented her observations with a scientist's fascination. He wrote, "She speaks of others as if she has access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. When I verify her observations through careful, discreet questioning of their relatives or by observing events as they unfold, they prove remarkably, almost uncannily, accurate." This wasn't psychosis or delusion. There were no voices, no hallucinations. This was a form of consciousness so advanced, so piercing, that it had become socially lethal. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. Because Helena's extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain through conventional means, it created a violent reaction in the people around her. This led Jung to investigate what he termed participation mystique, a state of profound, unconscious connection where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by the psychic contents of others. He wrote in notes from his Red Book period, "There are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment. They are psychic sponges, and often they drown in the toxicity they absorb." Modern research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons, or HSPs, validates Jung's early observations, suggesting that roughly 20% of the population has heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung was identifying a far more specific and rare subgroup within his psychological typology, the introverted intuitive type, comprising perhaps only 1% of the population. These individuals don't just feel deeply, they perceive unconscious patterns with startling, diagnostic clarity. And this is where the true danger begins. Jung realized the danger lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. He wrote, "When one sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, one becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look into." This creates what Jung called the problem of the superior function. This is the tragic paradox where your greatest, most developed strength becomes the source of your greatest burden and suffering because it separates you from the comforting embrace of collective unconscious participation. But when a perceptive person enters the room, their clarity acts as a mirror, reflecting that shadow back at its owner. The unconscious mind then has two choices: integrate the shadow, a difficult and painful process, or attack the mirror. Most people choose the latter. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly. The person who sees clearly is blamed for creating the problems they are merely observing. The child in a dysfunctional family who points out the alcoholism isn't seen as perceptive. They are labeled the problem child. The employee who senses the coming bankruptcy isn't seen as insightful. They are branded as negative or not a team player. The friend who gently asks about an unhappy marriage is accused of creating drama. Jung realized this wasn't a coincidence. It was a psychological defense mechanism, as predictable as a reflex. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most, it's far easier to attack the person reflecting their shadow than to do the hard work of self-examination." This creates what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals are often unconsciously designated as the problem in any group they enter. Not because they cause problems, but because their perception illuminates the problems that already exist, hidden in the collective unconscious. They become the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. They don't just feel misunderstood. They feel systematically targeted by an invisible, irrational force they cannot explain. As Jung worked with more patients like Helena, he observed that this overwhelming perception manifested differently depending on the individual's psychological makeup. He identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different way of processing the unconscious contents of others. Understanding your pattern is the first critical step toward integration. Type 1, the feeling intuitive or the empathic medium. These individuals combine introverted intuition with a highly differentiated feeling function. They don't just see what's happening psychologically, they feel it viscerally in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so completely that they often cannot distinguish between their own feelings and those they've unconsciously absorbed from the environment. They might feel a wave of profound sadness in a cheerful supermarket, only to realize later they were standing next to someone in mourning. Jung wrote, "The feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment. They are often plagued by mysterious ailments, fatigue, and anxiety that have no medical cause, because they are carrying the emotional weight of the world around them. Type 2. The thinking intuitive or the pattern prophet. These individuals combine their intuition with a thinking function. They see psychological patterns and can predict behavioral outcomes with chilling accuracy. They are the human chess masters who can see 10 moves ahead in any relationship or system. Jung observed they could forecast business failures, relationship collapses, and personal breakdowns months or even years before they occurred, not through logical deduction, but through unconscious pattern recognition. They see the invisible logic of the psyche. Jung noted, they possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see. Their tragedy is that they are rarely believed. They are the Cassandras of the world, blessed with the gift of foresight but cursed to be ignored, only to be resented later for having been right all along. Type 3. The sensation intuitive or the somatic seer. This type combines intuition with the sensation function. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in others. They might meet someone and get a dull ache in their liver, only to find out that person is a heavy drinker. They can detect illness before symptoms appear, sense deep fatigue in someone who claims to be energized, or feel the specific bodily tension that indicates repressed trauma or emotional distress. They experience the world as a physical echo of the collective psyche. Jung wrote, these individuals serve as living early warning systems for psychological and physical disease in their environment. Type 4. The pure intuitive, or the unfiltered oracle. This is the rarest and often most distressed type Jung encountered. They combine a dominant introverted intuition with what he called an undifferentiated auxiliary function. This means they have the massive perceptive input, but lack a well-developed secondary function, feeling, thinking, or sensation, to help them sort, process, and make sense of it. They see everything, but have immense difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. They live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving a tidal wave of unconscious information without an adequate psychological structure to process it constructively. This is often the starting point for perceptive individuals, a state of raw, unfiltered sight that can easily be misdiagnosed as a severe thought disorder, but is in fact a consciousness struggling to build its own operating system. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dire dangers, social persecution, existential isolation, and the dissolution of personal identity, Jung concluded that seeing everything without a framework for integration was a psychological emergency. He didn't seek to dull his patient's perception. Instead, he developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic, alchemical approach to turning this dangerous lead into philosophical gold. It's a path to maintaining your individual identity while developing a conscious, masterful relationship with the vast ocean of unconscious contents. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. He called this the Great Severing. The first and most crucial task Jung taught his perceptive patients was to recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't their own. He called this conscious discrimination, the foundational ability to distinguish between your authentic inner experience and the external content you have unconsciously absorbed. He wrote, the first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. The core technique for this phase is the disciplined practice of solitude. Jung instructed his patients to spend dedicated time in complete solitude every single day, not with a book or music, but in pure silence. This allows the psychic mud absorbed from the day to settle, so you can once again see the clarity of your own water. It's in this silence you can ask the question, is this anxiety mine? Is this anger mine? Is this despair mine? And listen for the authentic answer from your own soul. This is the act of building your first psychic boundary. Phase 2. Shadow integration. He called this embracing the monster. Jung made a profound discovery. People who see others' shadows with painful clarity often do so because they have not integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, for selfishness, for cruelty, the more horrified and disturbed you will be when you see these qualities in others. It's a form of psychic allergy. Jung famously wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Shadow integration is the courageous work of acknowledging that you, 2. Contain every human quality you observe in others. It doesn't mean you act on these impulses, but you acknowledge their existence within you. This is the key that unlocks non-judgmental perception. When you have accepted your own shadow, seeing it in another person is no longer a personal affront or a source of disgust. It becomes an impersonal observation. You can see clearly without being poisoned by what you see. Phase 3. Conscious participation. He called this becoming the wise bridge. The final phase is the mastery stage. It involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed and without losing your own identity. You transform from a psychic sponge into a psychological container. A container is a strong, safe space where difficult contents can be held and examined. Think of a master therapist. They can listen to the most harrowing stories without breaking down and without taking that trauma home with them. They hold the space for healing. The individuated perceptive person learns to do this in their daily life. They learn to listen with deep insight, but with clear boundaries. They develop the art of offering their perceptions not as pronouncements or judgments, but as gentle offerings. Instead of saying, "You're full of repressed rage," they might say, "I sense a great deal of energy and passion beneath your words." Is that right? They learn the art of sacred silence, understanding that 90% of what they perceive is not meant to be spoken. It is for their own understanding and compassion. Jung understood that this superior perception either destroys or transforms an individual. There is no middle ground. To understand this stark choice, he studied historical figures, seeing in their lives the blueprints for success and failure. His prime example of unintegrated perception was the brilliant philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Jung was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's work, recognizing in him a mind of breathtaking perceptive power. Nietzsche saw through the social, religious, and philosophical facades of his time with devastating clarity. He was a master of diagnosing the unconscious sickness of Western culture. However, Jung noted that Nietzsche never learned to integrate these insights constructively. He couldn't create a container for his own perception. Instead of using his insight in service of healing, he wielded it like a hammer, a weapon against society. Jung wrote, Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but he remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. He became the prophet, not the man. His eventual psychological collapse represented for Jung the tragic, inevitable outcome when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see, rather than transformed by it. In stark contrast, Jung held up the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart as an example of successful integration. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities far beyond the grasp of his contemporaries. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled his profound insights into compassionate service. He didn't use his clarity to attack, but to illuminate. Jung wrote, Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly, but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance. Eckhart's success, Jung believed, came from a profound conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, a sacred trust, not a weapon to be wielded for egoic superiority. And of course, there was Jung's own journey. His confrontation with the unconscious, documented in the Red Book, was his personal trial by fire. He wrote, I was menaced by a psychosis, admitting that his own superior perception of unconscious contents, both his own and others, nearly destroyed him. His breakthrough came when he stopped seeing these overwhelming visions and insights as pathological and began to see them as evolutionary, as consciousness itself attempting to break through to a new level. This realization was the cornerstone of his life's work. This leads us to Jung's ultimate conclusion about these rare individuals. They are not a mistake of nature. They are not cursed. Highly perceptive individuals serve an essential, vital evolutionary function for human consciousness. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote, the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. He believed that people with superior perception are consciousness pioneers. They are the advanced scouts, the psychological explorers whose development precedes the collective's readiness. Throughout history, they have appeared before society was ready to integrate their insights. The mystics, the artists, the paradigm-shifting scientists. They chart the psychological territories that humanity will eventually need to explore to survive and evolve. Jung believed that in our modern era, these individuals are more critical than ever. They are the ones sensing the deep psychological patterns that explain our collective crises. They feel the environmental and social unsustainability not as a concept, but as a physical pain. They perceive the collective shadow contents, our tribalism, our greed, our denial, that need to be made conscious before they manifest as global catastrophes. Jung's most profound insight here is that the sensitive individual feels the collective problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms, their anxiety, their depression, their feeling of alienation, often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. The goal, then, is not to be a martyr to consciousness, suffering silently. The goal is to become a conscious bridge between what is and what is becoming. Let's return to Helena, Jung's patient from 1913, the introverted intuitive who came to him on the brink of collapse. After 3 years of painstakingly working through Jung's individuation process, her life transformed. She learned the art of conscious discrimination. She developed a strong container for her perception. She integrated her own shadow, which allowed her to see the shadows of others with compassion instead of horror. She found work as a counselor, where her differentiated perception became her greatest asset, helping countless troubled individuals find their own way. She learned to build relationships with the few people who could value her insights rather than fear them. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her superior perception as a curse and began understanding it as what Jung called a sacred gift requiring conscious development. Jung wrote of her transformation, "The patient learned not to see less, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather than overwhelming." This is the final, powerful truth of Jung's most dangerous discovery, that some individuals are born with a consciousness that exceeds collective readiness. And this advanced perception will either destroy them through isolation and overwhelm, or it will transform them into precisely what humanity needs for its next evolutionary step. If you recognize yourself in this description, know this: your superior perception is not a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It is an advanced feature of consciousness development. You are not broken because you see everything others miss. You are, perhaps, psychologically ahead of your time. The question is no longer whether you should suppress your perception to fit in. The question is whether you will do the courageous work of individuation necessary to integrate your perception consciously. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it, and you become what Jung believed you were always meant to be: a consciousness pioneer, preparing humanity for a psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. The danger of seeing everything isn't that you see too much. It's that you might never learn to see with the integration, wisdom, and compassion your extraordinary gifts demand.